Hello, New Life Church. Glad to have you joining us for the message online this week. Hope you had a good week. This next week, late Monday evening, Nancy and I are hopping on a plane and we are flying out to Anaheim in California to visit our daughter Diana for a week. I've been trying to keep my expectations in check for this vacation, and sometimes I don't do that all that well, but on Tuesday morning, not long after we get there, we are going to be driving up the coast from Los Angeles, about halfway up the state to Monterey on the Pacific Coast Highway. Just like we'll be meandering up that highway, my message is going to be meandering a little bit today. Just kind of want to share with you a little bit about where I'm at, what I'm processing these days a little bit. I've wanted to drive the Pacific Coast Highway for many, many years, as I've got an older brother who says that the beauty just doesn't stop along that drive. Mountains and waterfalls and beautiful bays and rocky coastlines and ocean views and bridges. He says there's just so many places that you're going to want to stop. He said, make sure you allow for a lot of time for that drive. And I am planning to soak all of that in and try not to lament too much a week later when I'm getting back on the plane and flying here to Minnesota. We had a funeral this past week for one of our key members. Her name was Marby Marilyn Backstrom. And it was a wonderful time to be able to celebrate her life and her impact in this community and the world. After the funeral, I spent some time downstairs at the lunch and sat next to a guy who doesn't attend our church, but I've known him since I met him about 30 years ago during our ministry over in Brainerd, and he happened to be a friend of Marby's as well, which surprised me and all. We had this wonderful conversation together about heaven, and he and I wondered if heaven is going to be just like an eternal, non-stop existence of jaw-dropping experiences, where over and over and over again in heaven, we're going to be going, oh, wow. I think that might be true. John 14, verse 2, a verse that we read at Marby's funeral, speaks about this. It says, in my Father's house are many rooms. If it were not so, I would have told you, I am going there to prepare a place for you. Now, if he created this amazing world that we live in, this universe, in just 6 days, imagine how well he has been doing creating heaven over the last 2,000 years for us. And the thought hit me. I've been to the Grand Canyon once when I was 12 years old. During one of our future trips to California to visit Diana, we do want to go to the Grand Canyon, but that's not happening this particular trip. But the Grand Canyon was just absolutely amazing. If God can create a Grand Canyon that stuns people for its beauty and its immense size, could he not create a grander canyon that makes the Grand Canyon seem ho-hum? And if so, then could he not create a grandest canyon that puts the grander canyon to shame? And beyond that, could he create a greater grandest canyon that is better than all three of those combined? Of course he could. Let's not put any limitations on how we think about our gods. And my guess is that he probably already has. Somewhere in this universe, maybe it's in a different planet, in a different solar system, not like ours, there's a canyon that would make the Grand Canyon just look like kids' play. His creativity, after all, isn't limited to what we know on planet Earth. So here's where I'm at right now. Somehow, I want to grow closer to God in my relationship with him. And I want my familiarity and my closeness with God to grow deeper, while at the same time, instead of losing my awe, A-W-E, instead of losing my awe because of being familiar with him and close with him, I want to be able to somehow continue to foster an ever-increasing sense of awe of him as well. My attention has been drawn recently to Isaiah chapter 40. Isaiah is one of the major prophets from the Old Testament. He was a prophet during the reign of King Hezekiah, not long after the northern kingdom of Israel had been taken into exile and well over 100 years before the southern kingdom of Judah would end up suffering the same fate. Hezekiah was a good king, fairly godly king, not a perfect king. And I found it interesting after spending some time looking at Hezekiah chapter 40 to notice that in the previous chapter, in Hezekiah chapter 39, some envoys from the kingdom of Babylon visit Jerusalem, and King Hezekiah quite unwisely shows them all of the riches of his kingdom. It's a foolish thing to do because I'm sure that as soon as they got on the road headed back to Babylon, one of the first things they started talking about was, how many soldiers is it going to take for us to come back here to invade and get all those riches for us to be able to haul back to Babylon again? All right. Hezekiah seems to have an attitude of pride in that 39th chapter, pride in Israel's wealth, pride in his position and what he has achieved and accomplished. And immediately after he tries to impress his visitors with his wealth, God speaks in chapter 40 through Isaiah and displays God's greatness, as if to say, Hezekiah, don't be in awe of your little rock collection. We are in awe of the wrong things. And the goal of Satan, one of the goals of Satan, is to keep us distracted from being awe-filled at God by carting out endless counterfeits to temporarily capture our awe to the exclusion of God. That we would be awe-filled at created things rather than awe-filled at the Creator himself. So before we look at some verses in chapter 40, I want us to go back to Romans chapter 1. It's a verse that maybe you're familiar with, in a section where Paul is discussing the sexual depravity of mankind. In verse 25, he says, they exchanged the truth of God for a lie, essentially meaning that they rejected God's truth, broke his standards, and proclaimed allegiance to a new standard that they said, that they could have said, well, this is my truth, and I need to be faithful to my truth, which is a lie. And then the verse goes on to say, and they worshiped and served created things rather than the Creator who is forever praised. Amen. They became filled with awe at the created things of this world and ignored the Creator that had made those things in the first place. Every created awe is designed to convince you of the greatness of the Creator. Everything that God made in this world, everything that I'm going to see along the Pacific Coast Highway this next week, was designed so that we would be reminded of the magnificence of our Creator God. So with that in mind, let's jump into some verses from Isaiah 40 for the start of a little bit further of an explanation of this. Partway through the chapter, almost as if to respond to Hezekiah's pride in his acquisitions, God says in verse 12, who has measured the waters in the hollow of his hand? You go to one of our state parks up along the North Shore, and you might stand by a rushing waterfall, or you might be able to go to a pristine lake at Sunshine, or maybe go down to the beach at Lake Superior itself, or I'll be certainly be at the beach at the ocean next week, and you might be in awe of the vastness of the water, crashing waves, and we rightfully in those times often relish the beauty or the power in that moment. This verse tells us, look deeper. Someone is far greater than the beauty of the waters that are before you. He is so great that he uses the lines on his hands to measure the depths of the ocean. That's a pretty incredible being. That is a great Creator God. Verse 12 continues and says, or with the breadth of his hand marked off the heavens. Jump down a little bit to verse 26, where he also talks about heavenly beings, and he says this, lift up your eyes and look to the heavens. Who created all these? He who brings out the starry host one by one and calls them each by name. Because of his great power and mighty strength, not one of them is missing. Now, certainly, Isaiah is using some metaphorical speech here. There's no question about that. But it's not too far of a stretch to think that literally God could have named every star that is in the heavens. Look online, do a simple search, and you will find that scientists believe that there is something in the range of 200 billion trillion stars in the universe. I think that number is probably pretty low, to be totally honest. That's 200 billion trillion different names. It's a 23, or that's a 200 followed by 23 zeros, I believe. No, 21 zeros. All right? It's simply incomprehensible for us. Isaiah finds himself in this chapter stuck trying to describe something that is like totally indescribable. Words are just inadequate to capture the vast immensity of this universe that we find ourselves in, all the heavenly host up there. When I was a little kid, I looked at globes, and this is probably around the time when I was about 6, 7, maybe 8 years old. And I looked at globes and maps and started to understand a little bit more about this world that we were in, that it was a sphere, this planet that we live on and all. And I came to understand that on the other side of the globe, on the other side of the planet from where I lived, there were other countries, like China. And I remember that partly because my best friend during several of those years was a little boy from China. And I remember being outside and looking far off into the horizon and seeing a cloud that was way out there and thinking to myself, right now the people in China can see that cloud. Well, no, they can't. I had no comprehension as a little 8-year-old boy about the vastness of this world that we live in. I looked it up online, and the reality is that if you can see a cloud on the horizon, it's probably somewhere between maybe 30 and 60 miles away from where you are at. So the people seeing the clouds off there, they weren't as far away as China. They were as far away as Brainerd is from us. My puny little brain couldn't comprehend the vastness of this earth. God is saying in this verse, look at the night sky with the stars and the moon. And God says, I could put a full map of everything that is up there on a little corner of my palm print. We serve an amazingly great God. Yet that stunning greatness and power is somehow combined with tenderness, something you wouldn't expect in the greatest being in the universe. Verse 11 says, He tends His flock. God tends His flock like a shepherd and gathers the lambs in His arms. He goes on to say in verse 12, who has held the dust of the earth in a basket, or weighed the mountains on the scales and the hills in a balance? When you are amazed at the crops that you might go out and see during the summer season, or if you're a gardener to see the plants that grow up and all, I'm encouraged by this book to look at something like that and imagine a God who is big enough to toss out all of the soil for a huge field. So the whole state of Iowa, as if He's just carrying a basket with a little bit of dirt in it and throws it all out there. As you consider a skiing hill, Isaiah wants you to think of God picking up a mountain and weighing it on a scale. Recently, I picked up our 8-month-old puppy to weigh him, and I found that he weighs 80 plus pounds right now. And I thought to myself when I did it, well, he's still continuing to grow. This is probably the last time that I'm going to weigh him, because if I try it any further down the road, I'll probably end up in a wheelchair. He's just getting too big and too heavy for me. And I could imagine Isaiah saying, as he sees me saying, this is the last time I'm going to weigh this 80-pound dog, Isaiah saying, you wimp. You can barely lift up a dog, and yet you think that your life should revolve totally around you. Meanwhile, you don't even contemplate God's greatness when He could pick up Mount Everest with his forefinger and his thumb and drop it on a scale and tell you exactly how much Mount Everest weighs. You see, our vocabulary, Isaiah's vocabulary here, it's woefully inadequate to even describe God's greatness. But our minds have almost zero capacity to understand His great intelligence, His knowledge, His incredible wisdom. Verse 13 says this, who has understood the Spirit of the Lord, or instructed Him as His counselor? Whom did the Lord consult to enlighten Him? And Who taught him the right way? Who was it that taught him knowledge or showed him the path of understanding? Back to my puppy. All right. So first, scientists have determined that in the average human body, there are about 30 trillion individual cells. In the average human adult, about 200 billion cells for every pound. And I looked online and checked it out, and dogs or most mammals are pretty much about the same. If you have a pound of animal, if you've got a pound of puppy, you've got about 200 billion cells. Well, I have watched this dog of ours. It's a Bernese Mountain Dog, and he is going to be a big, well, he already is a pretty big dog. I've watched this dog of ours grow from about 10 pounds last August when we got him to 80 pounds right now. So he's grown about 10 pounds per month. Do the math on that. And what I come to the realization of is that for the last 7 months, every day, my dog has added about 66 billion cells every day. How do they know where to go and what to do? How did that get programmed? Listen, that is more than, on average, that is more than 700,000 cells per second. I've done the math. That's correct. 700,000 brand new cells being created in his body every single second, perfectly deployed and sent out to function in perfect harmony with the rest of his trillions of cells, with the one exception that I'm really not sure that many of his brain cells are working all that well quite yet. Isaiah asks this question: who taught God the right way? To assemble a puppy so that it grows with perfect proportion. Earlier in the chapter, Isaiah has made it very clear where humans stand, what they are like in comparison with God. In verse 6, it says this: all men are like grass, and all their glory is like the flowers of the field. The grass withers and the flowers fall because the breath of the Lord blows on them. It's just his breath. Surely the people are grass, he says in verse 7. What is he saying? He's saying this: human beings are so fragile that any glory that we might carry is so fleeting and vulnerable that it fades as quickly as a flower that blooms or a grass that withers. God wouldn't even have to use a finger to do away with us. His simple breath would be enough, would be more, than what we could stand. Verse 22, it says this: God sits enthroned above the circle of the earth, and its people are like grasshoppers. Last Sunday was Super Bowl weekend. Los Angeles Rams beat the Cincinnati Bengals. I was a little bit disappointed in the outcome of that game. I think a lot of us were here in the Midwest wanting a Midwest city to have their team win and all. But the Super Bowl showcases some of the NFL's most talented and physically fit specimens. These guys are so fast. They are so strong. And many of them are very, very intelligent as well. But before the Super Bowl, one of our Twin Cities news channels interviewed some of the Minnesota Vikings from the 1970s when we went to 4, count 'em, Super Bowls. And yes, for those of you who are not Vikings fans, we lost them all, and you can smile at that. Carl Eller and Bud Grant and Alan Page and Chuck Foreman, I think, were part of those interviews. These were my childhood heroes that are now old and gray and bald and limping and are well past their prime. Isaiah is kind of referring to something similar to that. Those that we revere today will be has-beens in a very short period of time. They will be like grasshoppers. That's what he means in Isaiah 40, verse 23, when he says, God brings princes to naught and reduces the rulers of this world to nothing. When we see great human ability. And some of you are probably watching the Olympics during the evenings, like Nancy and I are doing some nights. You see a figure skater who can jump and while in the air rotate 4 times around and land on a narrow piece of metal. And when we look at something like that, God would want us to say, she's got great skills, but after they fade away, her infinitely greater creator lives on. So stand in awe at the creator behind the creation rather than being so enamored with the creation itself. God wants us to reflect on a beautiful dog and think about the amazing creator that made such an animal. He wants us to look on the ultrasound of an unborn baby and not be blown away simply because of the scientific and medical technology to see the outline of a baby's face inside a woman's womb, but to be in far greater silent awe at the creator that makes that perfect new life possible. So twice in the chapter, about 2/3 of the way in and then right near the end, Hezekiah asks a couple of questions about God. The same questions are repeated 2 times over. He says, "Do you not know? Have you not heard?" Now, I used to look at those questions and think that what he means is just, do you still not believe that there's a God behind all of this? As if he's addressing the skeptical scientist who somehow still thinks that this incredible universe that we live in arrived by chance. But I think those 2 questions, do you not know? Have you not heard? I think it's more than just a rebuke to the skeptic. God is speaking, after all, to his people. I think that he's actually saying to us, you still do not know how great, how awe-inspiring, how blow your mind incredible your great God, your great creator God is. Now I've come to that conclusion that that's the sense of this verse, partially because of what may be the most relevant verse in this entire chapter. And it actually comes in verse 27, where it says this: "Why do you say, O Jacob, and complain, O Israel? My way is hidden from the Lord. My cause is disregarded by my God." Why do you ask those questions? This is what Isaiah is really trying to address in this entire chapter, where he is magnifying the greatness of God, and in a few of those verses speaking about mankind as being like grass or a grasshopper. You see, the northern kingdom of Israel had already been taken into exile, and the remainder of the southern kingdom of Judah is slipping in power and prominence as well. And the people have certainly asked this question, and still are probably asking this question: why isn't God taking care of his chosen people? God must not be as powerful as we thought he once was. Christians quietly ask this question or similar questions all the time. Why isn't God solving my problems? Doesn't he care? Isn't he big enough? Is he incapable of solving the problems in my life? Listen to me. Our conclusions about God's nearness, or God's kindness, or God's concern for us will never be accurate if they are based primarily on our assessment of the circumstances in our lives. My conclusions about God must be based on his unchanging nature, period. Isaiah is saying this: wait, don't you actually know who this is that you are following? Haven't you heard how great our covenant God actually is? Haven't you understood his incredible greatness? He is saying it is the epitome of craziness to believe that God can't see your problems. It's incredibly foolish to think that God isn't concerned about your pain or your broken heart, that somehow he has lost track of your desire for justice. You are believing in a God that is a mere shadow of the true God, and the true God's greatness. Listen to me. When life gets hard, yes, we sometimes suffer. But because of a flawed worldview, we suffer not just because of the size of the things that we are facing, but also because of the smallness of the God that we actually believe in. I'm not saying we believe in a small God. I'm saying we oftentimes have a small belief about how big our God is. We worship God because of his goodness to us, and that is certainly appropriate. We experience so many blessings from him, and they cause us to worship. We have good jobs, and we've been blessed with good homes, and our health, and our family, and clothes, and comfort. We have heat in this building. We live in homes that are heated in a horrifically cold part of this state. In addition to that, we've been blessed with his salvation. On and on and on the list of blessings go. But we absolutely must worship God and stand in awe of him. Most importantly, because of his greatness rather than just his goodness toward us. No matter whether he answers or doesn't answer our prayers to our satisfaction. So let me leave you with just a couple of key lessons that can be gained from this chapter. The first one is this. Isaiah 40 instructs us to adopt a worldview that places God and his greatness in the very center of it. So we must remember God. It's something that I'm planning to do as I drive along the Pacific Ocean next week. As I look out at the beauty of it and all, I'm going to remind myself over and over again, not this is a great ocean, but there is a great creator behind this great ocean and these incredible views. And then the second thing that I want us to take from Isaiah 40 is this. Isaiah 40 shows us that while many people remember God, the God they remember is small, distant, disconnected, uncaring, or seems unwise. I am not saying that describes God. I am saying that describes that describes our remembrance, our memories, our thoughts, our conclusions about God and his greatness. We don't think of him the way that we need to think of him. But if we did, the disappointments of this life, the challenges that we face, the frustrations at our job or in our marriages, they would not seem near as overwhelming as they do to us if all we do is harbor a diminished view of the God that we serve. That was Isaiah's point in this chapter. Read the chapter yourself. Study it for yourself. Sit and contemplate and meditate on it. You will come to the same conclusion, I believe. Let's pray. Oh God, we thank you. I thank you for this chapter. I have been so encouraged to have studied it recently and to look at it and say, well, of course, if I could just raise to the place that it ought to be, if I could just raise my concept of your greatness, even though I can't fathom everything about you, God, but if I could just realize how infinitely great that you are, then my worries, my concerns, my problems, my difficulties, my ailments would just seem so much smaller in comparison. I thank you for loving us. I thank you for being by our side. Forgive us, God, for thinking of you way more inadequately than we should. And fill us with a deeper and greater abiding sense of awe in our Creator God, who has made this incredible world that we live in. And it's in his name that I pray. Amen. Thanks for joining us today. I hope you have a wonderful week. God bless you all.